Greetings and salutations, cohort 30. This is Dee Brown. My preferred gender pronouns are she and they. And this is our first week of infomercials in Education 452B. This class is focused on, as the syllabus states, a critical look at urban education. So I wanted to say welcome, and hopefully you'll enjoy this short video that talks about one of the articles. But before we get there, I wanted to take a minute to talk about the structure or focus for this week's class. So in reading the syllabus, I did want to, sort of make a note, or at least have us engage in a little bit of critical thought about the use of urban. I'm sure that some of us have heard it with colleagues or friends or other people within educational spaces, within educational institutions, maybe even about music. And I wanted to maybe start with a little think piece as you sort of prep for the class and think about the terms that we're using within our class space. So I thought I'd start with this short video.
Now this gentleman right here is the key to our urban vibe.
So this is a clip from The Office, the fourth season, and here Michael, who is sort of the administrator, the manager for The Office, refers to Stanley, his black colleague, as the reason for the urban vibe. And Stanley's response is...
Now this gentleman right here is the key to our urban vibe.
So Stanley's response is to say, urban? I grew up in a small town. Which then sort of asks the question about what urban means in a context and space like this. So I did look around to see if there were folks who are writing about the use of terminology like urban or urban education within not only education, but also educational leadership. And I found what I feel is a really helpful article to at least begin some of the conversation about this idea of urban. So Diane Watson, who's a professor at a school in Portland, Oregon, Lewis and Clark, wrote this piece in Rethinking Schools from 2011. It says, "What do you mean when you say urban? Speaking honestly about race and students." So her introduction, she makes a note and says, I've looked into the dictionary, and urban means related to the city, characteristic of a city or city life. So what does that mean when we say urban education? And why then do we use the term urban when what we really mean are schools with majority Black and Latino populations? She later states in the same article, I thought, oh, yeah, in the process of interviewing 17 different teachers who teach at quote unquote urban schools after they completed an urban curriculum, an urban training workshop for professional development. And one of her aha moments was this. Then I thought, oh yeah, urban means less than. The kids who are doing well, the kids who know how to do school are normal, and the kids who don't know how to do school are urban. So then it begs the question that she asks in her article, does it matter what language we use? It only matters if you're going to use it to mask your feelings, overly positive or negative, about a race or economic group. This is no time for euphemisms and unexamined beliefs about race. Our schools are deeply divided along racial and class lines. We need teachers who will examine themselves as racial beings who teach other racial beings and figure out what they are doing wrong and what they are doing right. And I think that's a really important question, I think, for all of us to not only bring into ELP space, but also for us to bring into our own work environments, our own educational spaces, and our own projects. So Watson goes on within that same article to really conclude with this statement, which I think is powerful and a good segue into talking about my article for the week. She says, what would it look like to use race words, e.g., African American, European American, Korean American, when thinking about your classroom and curriculum? You might test yourself by starting to use Black when you really mean it, instead of low achieving, underserved, at risk, our kids, those kids, inner city, or urban. So, what do you mean when you say urban? So as we move from, again, just kind of the conversation, the general conversation about the use of certain language, I think it's important to, again, move into this article thinking about not only the language that we use in terms of race and racism, but also our own ability to engage in what Dr. Howard refers to as racial literacy. And how we show up in spaces, how we engage in trying to really think about our own power and privilege within not only the classroom, but as administrators and education professionals. What does that actually look like? And so you can see some of the things that are included on this slide, which I found really powerful. One, obviously, a spotlight on racial literacy and the fact that, some of Professor Howard's work looks directly at teachers, right? And what happens when we have 80% of teachers who are white, who are really working through, and we hope, engaging in a process of learning about racial literacy, and what happens when we deal with things like white fragility or fear to openly discuss race. So in some ways, those things might be part of this and might not, but those are some of the background in terms of Professor Howard's work. Most of his research has focused on issues tied to race, culture, access, and educational opportunity for minoritized student populations. So that's included a really very important book called Why Race and Culture Matters in Schools, as well as a second book called All Students Must Thrive. He also writes specifically on Black male students. So again, really important, wonderful figure, and someone that we have here at UCLA. So for today's class, we will be looking at Professor Howard's piece entitled Why Black Lives and Minds Matter, Race, Freedom Schools, and the Quest for Educational Equity. It was an article that was published in the Journal of Negro Education in 2015. And really use the Black Lives Matter movement as a touchstone to enter into and introduce this conversation. And I really appreciated really early on an open conversation about being unapologetically Black and what that actually looks like, and really carrying that through in the piece. So we'll start from there. So, in this really important piece, I do think the way that I imagine it is that the article, in summary, is sort of two halves. So, one, looking at sort of the state of affairs that we have within our schools. And really a specific look, especially in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, and really the reality of not only lived experience in the streets for Black people, but also within educational institutions. While Dr. Howard doesn't mention this directly, he does reference Michel Foucault in his piece, and talks a bit about surveillance. And so I've included here a picture of a panopticon, which was famously sort of talked about by Jeremy Bentham in the 1800s, and then picked up again by Michel Foucault to talk about the way that we essentially engage in surveillance. And there are many, many, many carceral institutions that utilize the panopticon as a way to surveil, right? As a way to constantly be watching, right? Or at least the thought that you're constantly being watched, right? So the idea behind the panopticon, if you can see it really in both images, is that within a carceral system, incarcerated individuals are aware of the presence of authority at all times, even though they never know exactly when they're being observed. So that's true, even more so now because of technology, right? So early prisons, right? The first prison, ironically, that utilized Bentham's panopticon was actually in New Delhi in a colonized space. And that prison is still operational. It was finished in 1816. So clearly, this has been a central idea within our carceral system, and many have argued that we're seeing this now ever more present within our school system, right? And the idea behind the panopticon, right, is that the authority changes from being a limited physical entity, right, someone who is standing in front of your door, right, to being an internalized omniscience, an internalized understanding that you are always being watched, right? And that the result is that prisoners end up disciplining themselves because there's a thought that someone might be watching. And there's an argument that was put forward by Foucault that says that's what we all do, right? In the process of socialization, we all are actively policing ourselves and in turn also policing others to meet the norms and standards of a specific social environment. And so again, really powerful. If you've never read Foucault, I can put some links up, but it's sort of tied into what I believe is Dr. Howard's argument about policing Black bodies in schools. And in that process, even in how he writes about it in the article, there is a level of dehumanization, a lack of dignity that is highlighted in terms of Black lived experience within not only society, but definitively in school spaces. And that there is no understanding of sort of childhood or youth, right? That you are viewed very differently within that space that is at times inhumane. Again, not overly stated in the article, but that's my read of it. And that normalized Black criminality shows up and is embedded in our school environments, especially school environments that have larger numbers of Black students. And that ties into what we're seeing very overtly, which is a school to prison pipeline. So some of this, again, this panopticon, which I've spent far too much time talking about, includes this internalized authority and the imprisoning of the mind, right? How safe and comfortable do you feel if you feel like someone's always watching you, that you become a hyper visible person within a school environment? And again, what we know from Howard's piece and really his reference to other work is that that's what we see, right? That it does negatively impact the learning for Black students. So I wanted to show you a video that I think is really important. I am putting a trigger warning because it does include violence, especially violence against young people of color. But I think it's important just to have a really solid understanding of what we're seeing in school spaces in video as opposed to what we read in the paper.
There's this phrase that you might hear in the news sometimes, the school to prison pipeline. It's shorthand for how schools are funneling students, especially Black students, into the criminal justice system. It started in the 90s when schools responded to fears about crime with zero-tolerance policies, which mandated suspensions and expulsions for certain violations. They also cracked down on little things like talking back or uniform violations. The hope was that it would keep bigger problems from bubbling up. But as a result, out-of-school suspensions have doubled since the 1970s, and they keep increasing even though juvenile crime rates have now been dropping for years. Around the same time, the number of police officers stationed full-time inside schools has increased by a third between 1997 and 2007. Ostensibly, they were there to prevent mass school shootings like the one at Columbine, but they end up being a way for schools to basically outsource discipline to the police. Schools with officers have 5 times as many arrests for disorderly conduct as schools without them. Sometimes the results are shocking. But the less visible effect is that schools are feeding the racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Consider the fact that schools are more likely to have an officer on their campus if the student population is more than 50% Black. You might assume that that's because there's more crime at these schools, but although students at police schools are more likely to be arrested, they're not actually more likely to be charged in court for weapons, drugs, alcohol, or assault, at least according to one study. During the 2010-2011 school year, 1 in 6 public school students in the US were Black, but they accounted for 1 in 3 arrests at school. Same goes for other forms of school discipline. Black students are suspended or expelled 3 times more frequently than white students. It actually begins in preschool. 18% of preschoolers are Black. But if all preschoolers suspended more than once, 48% are Black. Studies show that differences in behavior can't fully account for these disparities. Black students and white students are sent to the principal's office at similar rates, but Black students are more likely to end up with a serious punishment. One study found that white students are more likely to be suspended for provable offenses like smoking or vandalism. Black students are more likely to be suspended for subjective offenses like talking back or insubordination. Students who are suspended in school are more likely to later drop out or get arrested. So the federal government is asking schools to make suspension and expulsion the absolute last resort. In Oakland, California, public schools are trying something called restorative justice, where both parties in a conflict talk it out with a counselor instead of relying on punishment. The results are pretty encouraging. In the last 10 years, chronic absenteeism is down, and graduation rates are up in the schools that have tried it. Other cities and districts are also trying new policies. They're hoping that if their students end up in the criminal justice system, at least it won't be because the schools push them there.
So I wanted you all to see that. It's embedded here so you can actually check it out later. And that restorative justice piece, I think, really takes us into the second half of Dr. Howard's piece, the article, where there's really an open conversation about culturally responsive teaching and really culturally relevant pedagogy. And for this particular article, he really uses the freedom schools as sort of the touchstone, right? As the pedagogical way that we see that these programs are working, right? And so he talks a bit about the Children's Defense Fund's Freedom Schools program. It is typically a 6-week program that's focused on literacy that takes place in the summer. And really has some tremendously important history, which I'll get to in a second. Within Dr. Howard's piece, he doesn't really touch on much of the history, but I wanted to include some images and really talk a little bit about that history and how integrally connected to the civil rights movement it was. So freedom schools are still active. There are freedom schools here in Los Angeles and really throughout the country. And they really are, in terms of cultural pedagogy and culturally relevant pedagogy, they are tied to African history, Black history, and really uplifting the voices of Black people. And that's been expanded, right? So Black and brown people. And so here you can see I included one of the logos, I'll just highlight that here, of a program called Play on Purpose, which has a freedom school in the summer, and they include the Sankofa bird. And so Sankofa, which comes from the Akan people from West Africa, is really a symbol really tying into that connection, right? Our connection to the African continent, our connection to our roots. A majority of enslaved peoples have roots and are tied to that particular part of the African continent. And really, this symbol is tied to learning our history and learning our stories, and this idea that we can go back and fetch them, so that we can use them to better understand the today and build for tomorrow. And so, again, powerful image that we see here. For one of the freedom schools that's active, and still active. So the other piece is that what we see in this reimagine, education is a move away from punitive activity in the classroom. It is really focused on building scholars, right? So these young people are not students, they are scholars. And their teachers are really engaged in service, right? They are servant leaders within the classroom, really trying to connect and do that intergenerational work. So again, things that Dr. Howard ties into, right? That the freedom schools are really centering racial and cultural identities and building restorative justice models within that school space. And what they've seen is improvements to literacy on the back of a 6-week program. So here, I include just a little bit of the history. This book is great if you've never seen it before. Freedom School, yes. It's a wonderful book to share with folks. And talks about the summer of 1964, where we saw over 2,500 Black children in Mississippi, essentially attending schools and local churches, local community spaces, that were really the birth of the Freedom School model, was led by activists within the civil rights movement. So really it was a social justice project organized collaboratively by the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, especially the activist Bob Moses, who passed in 2021, as well as the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So they worked together. And while we saw many adults active in the civil rights movement, the idea was to build an intergenerational link. And so many of the young people were actually tasked with doing some of that educational piece, right? With younger Black students. So you can see some of the images here that I've included, as well as a recent image. So this was actually from a Chicago, the bottom left image here is from a Chicago Freedom School. And if you can see or read the signs, it says fun schools, not jails, both in English and Spanish. And this was really their social justice, activism, organizing skills workshop that was part of their Freedom School. So I just wanted to highlight that, and really highlight the fact that this is part of a long tradition, right? And to give you some idea of the pedagogical piece, right? It wasn't only to deal with what is very deficit minded, right? Like a learning loss or a gap or whatnot, that it was to really enrich and empower these Black students to tap into reading and learning and literacy. But also on a deeper level, you see college age SNCC members teaching a curriculum that's celebrating Black history. Right, that they're actively engaged in picking books and music and poetry, dance, theater, all sorts of things that we've heard about now in oral histories, that are meant to really highlight the strength, power, and richness of Black history and culture. So again, some of the things that I want to highlight. So one of the schools, Glenda Funchess, gave an interview for the Civil Rights History Project, and she actually talked about students performing a puppet show featuring a knight fighting the wicked witch of segregation. So it gives you some idea of a difference in pedagogy, a difference in message within the Freedom Schools. So that's sort of it. I think that's probably a good place for us to start and stop. I included a couple of slides here at the end, and if you indulge me, I hope you will. One, I included a quote from Toni Morrison that to me really highlights this unapologetic centering of Black culture in the midst of racism. And so Toni Morrison writes, "The function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language, so you spend 20 years proving that you do. None of that is necessary. There will always be one more thing. So for me, in reading that, I really see this conversation that hopefully we'll have within our class space about racism and white supremacy and the things that it does, right? And its impacts, obviously the traumas that are also part of that process of again, these structural systems, but also the fact that we have these restorative pieces that are focused on the richness and deepness of our cultures and heritages. So something to think about, and again ties into what the Freedom Schools do every day at the beginning of their day. They call it Harambe, which really is just that call to bring everyone in, that we're pulling everyone together. And so this is actually during one of their national trainings, where one of the trainers explains what Harambe is and sort of walks through this process.
Harambe is a Swahili word that means let's pull together. Everybody say, let's pull together. Now, the phrase was used in Kenya upon the release of Jomo Kenyatta. And he was an activist and had been in prison for several years. He had not committed a crime of any sort. He wanted freedom for his people. He was seeking that freedom. And of course, there were people who did not like that. So they imprisoned him. And while he was in prison, he was treated very harshly. However, upon the end of his term, he was elected president by his people. So upon his release, there was fear that his followers would seek revenge for those who had treated him very harshly while he was imprisoned. However, during his first speech as president, he asked his brothers and his sisters to join hands, and he asked them to shout Harambe 3 times, with that last and final one being the loudest. So they said, Harambe, Harambe, Harambe. And this is a practice that's still used in Kenya today to settle conflicts and disputes. However, in the CDF Freedom Schools program, we always remix things a little bit to fit our needs. So we take this same methodology and we implement it into the CDF Freedom Schools program. So in Harambe, we start with the read aloud, the read aloud. And this is an opportunity for us to invite people into our CDF Freedom School site. We want to show the children that regardless of what it is you choose to be in life, reading is involved. So we want that doctor, we want that firefighter, but we also want that cosmetologist. We want that choreographer. We want the manager of McDonald's. We want that professor. We want to show the children a wide array of occupations that are in the community. And we want them to see that this is how reading is involved. This is what it takes to become that manager or what have you. And we want them to ask questions to those individuals so they can begin that dialogue and understand exactly what it means to become that professional. We move then from the read aloud to our motivational song, and our motivational song is entitled, and it is written by Labi Sifre, who as well was an activist. And the words are simply, there's something inside so strong. I know that I can make it, though you're doing me wrong. And so this again is just instilling that positive reinforcement, giving the children what they need to believe that they indeed can make a difference, and just positive reinforcement throughout the Harambe time. So if we're looking at this in the analogy of a roller coaster, we're kind of getting to that top. You know, anybody ever been on a roller coaster in there? Okay, so now we're at the top. We're getting ready to drop down that huge hill, and we're at the cheers and chants. Cheers and chants. Say cheers and chants. And then you do your little fresh thing there. Okay, so then we start with, okay, our cheers and chants. And this is an opportunity, again, to just talk about how reading is cool, being a positive person is great, positive reinforcement again, and uplifting that positive attitude and instilling that love of reading with the children by doing some positive cheers and chants. We transition from the cheers and chants to recognitions. And this is an opportunity for you as the servant leader interns, the students, anyone who may be in the site to recognize something positive. So the person who has a recognition says, I have a recognition. I said I have a recognition. And then you want to be sure that in order for you to recognize the person who's being recognized, you have to take a seat. Take a seat. Take a load off your feet. Then you proceed with your recognition so that that person being recognized can be recognized, right? If we're all standing, then it seems as if we're all being recognized. So be sure that when you begin your recognitions, you start by having a seat. Also, I want to be mindful that we refrain from using recognitions that are based on materialistic type of things, because we know that the children that we serve may not always come to the site with a fresh pair of kicks or a new hairstyle or some new clothes. We want to recognize those things that are on the inside, intrinsically motivate the children to want to seek change. So we want to recognize Miss Bree, who might have helped her intern clean up after lunch, and she didn't necessarily have to. We want to recognize the birthdays. We want to recognize a scholar who may have helped their peer do something that he or she may not have thought that he or she could do. So we want to be sure that we're recognizing things for on the inside of our students, to be sure that we build them up, because this may be the only time that they get a recognition, because their parents may not do it, their teachers may not do it, but as CDF Freedom School staff, we want to be sure that we do it. So we want to really, really go in on the recognitions portion. We move from recognitions to our moment of silence. Just again, keeping in the analogy of our roller coaster, we're kind of getting ready to get off so we can transition to the integrated reading curriculum. Take a moment of silence. You can close your eyes if you choose to. You can breathe in positivity. You can exhale negativity. You can breathe in having a good day. You can breathe in anything that you want to breathe in, really. And then you can exhale anything that may be holding you back from having that good day. We end our moment of silence by saying Ashe, and you repeat. And Ashe is also a Swahili word that means so it is or let it be. We end our Harambe time with announcements. I said a A-N-N and a O-U-N and a C-E-M-E-N-T-S. Okay, thanks. So, again, just in that of itself, you're teaching the students how to spell announcements in a cute, fun way, teaching them how to spell announcements. But announcements is just that. It's an opportunity for you as a staff, administrative personnel to come up and make an announcements to the large group. There's really a lot of learning taking place during this 30 minutes. It's call and response, sequencing, listening skills. We are addressing all areas of learners, audio, visual, bodily kinesthetic. There's a lot of sequencing going on here, and there's a lot of educational elements that are embedded in this 30 minutes of Harambe. So please make sure to push those points to parents, to teachers, to principals, anyone in the community who wants to learn a little bit more about our Freedom Schools program. Let them know that, yes, we are having fun. Learning is taking place during this 30 minutes, and it is really important for the students to engage. So it starts a little something like this. It's Monday.
So thank you for indulging me with that. I really wanted you to see what that process looks like and how the Freedom School sets up its model. Again, very culturally tied activity. And then some other programs that I wanted to just touch on. These are more sort of deeper dive resources for folks that are interested in this material. One, there's a great organization called Teaching for Change, and they have a week of action usually in the fall, and some of the things that are tied to Black Lives Matter at school are things like end zero tolerance, again, tied to that discipline and punishment piece in our school system, the mandate Black history and ethnic studies, hire more Black teachers, and fund counselors, not cops, right? So again, really, really important pieces about powerful program that happens in DC once a year. I'd love to have that extended to other spaces. And then here I've put in a whole slew of deeper dive items and resources, one about Freedom Schools, an article about the history of Freedom Schools. There's also an amazing Cora learning course that's run by Dr. J. Luke Woods at San Diego State, who has an entire course called Black Minds Matter that is a free course that you can go through to learn more about this topic. Again, I mentioned the Teaching for Change. There's a great book called Teaching for Black Lives. There are also some social justice book lists that include really useful books that don't give you just sort of the very oversimplified version of social justice figures, but really talks about sort of that collective activity that's required in social justice movements. Rethinking Schools, if you have never been on that site, or the Zen Education Project, they're great. They also have curriculum that's embedded in both of those spaces. And Social Justice Books also has a separate page just about teaching young children about race and including tips and tools for those conversations. And on the other side of it, I've also included a couple of videos about white fragility, white supremacy, the racist origins of our U.S. legal system, as well as mass incarceration. And that mass incarceration video talks specifically about what we know to be the school to prison pipeline. So I just wanted to give those pieces and also maybe end with a quote from Dr. King later in life. It was actually about a month before his assassination. He actually really highlighted the fact that he was complicated and was really opting for more revolutionary activity. So he says, "Our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out into a sometimes hostile world, declaring internal hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism. We are now faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now." And I think, again, just a powerful way to kind of end this conversation. I appreciate you and indulging me in this time. And I'll play a little bit of this before I end this video. This is the piece Labi Sifri, Something Inside So Strong, which was a song that came out of South Africa and South African apartheid in 1987. Thank you.